Hi guys, welcome to part 3 of I Survived the Children's Blizzard at 1888. I'm going to be reading the last part. I'm going to be reading like the rest of the book. So we were at chapter 14. We were at chapter 14 when we stopped. Remember like the blizzard is going on right now. The entire building shook. A window shattered, and snow and ice exploded into the schoolhouse. But John hardly noticed. He barely heard the screeching wind or the cries of the little kids. He was looking all around. Where was Franny? It was very dark inside the schoolhouse. Miss Rule struggled to light a lantern, but John could see well enough to see that Franny wasn't there. A crack of fear almost knocked him off his feet. She'd been playing hide and seek. She'd probably found some perfect hiding spot off in the corner of the schoolyard. Then everyone ran inside. She'd been left behind. How had John let that happen? How could he have forgotten his sister? John rushed to the door and flung it open. A vicious blast of wind and snow nearly knocked him down. He clung to the door frame to keep his balance. "Franny!" he cried. Miss Rule called to him. "John, no!" But John couldn't wait. Franny was out there. The storm's icy hook seemed to snatch him from the doorway. The wind roared in his ears and yanked him down the stairs. It threw him onto the ground. Ice and snow lashed his face. He gasped for breath as the freezing air shook his lungs. John grabbed the stair railing and struggled to his feet. He pushed himself forward, staggering into the frozen darkness that had swallowed the schoolyard. Roar! The storm screamed back. He looked around, but it was impossible to see. The snow had gushed down from the sky and churned in the wind. Ground-up ice flew into John's eyes, coating his eyelashes and lids. With each blink, the ice scraped painfully against his eyeballs. But even worse was the furious wind, which slashed at him from every direction. John felt as if he was locked in a cage with a pack of wild beasts, all trying to tear him into bits. He thought of that farmer who had died in last year's blizzard. It hadn't really made sense to John. How a strong man could get lost and freeze to death just a few yards from his house. But now John was staggering blindly along, spinning in the wind. He understood it all too well. Crushed bits of snow sifted down his collar and blew up his sleeves and trouser legs. Soon every inch of his skin was crusted with ice. The cold seeped through his flesh and muscles and stabbed into his bones. John was shivering so hard his bone felt as if they would crack apart. A gust of wind smashed against him. He fell back into the snow, and now he couldn't stand up. The wind pressed down on him, like a giant boot crushing him into the ground. Ice was filling his nose, making it harder and harder to breathe. A feeling of terror came over John. He had never felt so tiny and so helpless. He'd made a terrible mistake, he realized. There's no way he would be able to find Franny in this blizzard. He was going to freeze to death. Chapter 15. John mustered the last of his strength and screamed at the top of his lungs, "Franny!" The blizzard screamed back, but then another voice punched through the blizzard's howl. "John!" It wasn't Franny, it was Miss Rule. Her voice was muffled by the wind, but he thought she was somewhere very close, and then a hand clamped onto his arms. Miss Rule had found him. She gripped his arms tighter and managed to pull him up. John was so freezing cold that his body wasn't working right. He couldn't feel his feet. He kept stumbling, falling to his knees. Luckily, Miss Rule was stronger than she looked. She wrapped her arms around John's waist, and she practically dragged him through the rising snowdrifts and up the steps to the schoolhouse door. The next thing John knew, he was inside. He collapsed onto the floor. He couldn't see through his frozen eyes, but he felt people surrounding him. Hands swept snow from his head. Gentle fingers brushed ice from his face. A blanket came down his shoulders. John would have died of embarrassment if he wasn't practically frozen to death. And then someone hugged him. John smelled apples and soap. Could it be? Was he dreaming? Franny! Hot tears welled up in John's eyes, melting the ice that crusted his lashes and lids. He stared at his sister's face. He had never in his life felt so relieved. Why did you go outside? She cried. I thought you were lost, John stuttered through his chattering teeth. I was looking for you. I snuck inside and was here hiding under Miss Rule's desk for the game. No wonder John didn't see her. Help John and let's get him closer to the stove, Miss Rule said. Peter, Rex, and Sven all lifted John to his feet and practically carried him through the room. Myra brought over a chair so he could sit. The guys hovered around him. Franny glued herself to John's side, but Miss Rule shooed everyone away. Let him get warm, she said. Myra took Franny by the hand and the guys moved away. Miss Rule was still covered with snow. She was untying a rope that was knotted around her waist. John realized she must have tied the other end to something in the schoolhouse. That's how she had made sure she would be able to find her way back inside. How smart, Miss Rule, and brave. She must think he was a fool to run outside in the blizzard. She must hate him more than ever. John took a breath. I'm sorry, ma'am, she said. His teacher looked at him with surprise. She wasn't wearing her glasses. Her bun had come loose. Brown curls hung around her face. She didn't look scary. I thought your sister was out there. You thought your sister was out there, she said. What you did was brave. Their eyes locked together for a moment. A gentle smile flickered across his teacher's face. She patted John's arms before she walked back to her desk. Maybe it was the fire in the stove, but suddenly John felt warmer. The wind screamed louder. The schoolhouse walls shuddered, and the windows rattled. But Miss Rule, her hair back in a bun, was so steely and calm. She gave all the older kids jobs. When John was warmed up again, he helped the guys sweep away the snow that was sifting under the door and through the cracks in the wall. Myra and Annie kept watch over the little kids and soon had them playing Simon Says. Moving around helped them stay warm. John kept his eyes on Franny, but now he couldn't stop thinking about Ma and Pa. What if Pa had been out in the field when the blizzard hit? What if Ma had been in the barn? It was very cold in the schoolhouse, even with Miss Rule feeding extra coal into the roaring fire in the stove. John kept looking at the coal bin. There was barely enough coal to last a few hours more. What would happen when all the coal was gone? They would have to burn the books and then the desks. And after that, John tried not to think about it. Chapter 16. Suddenly the schoolhouse door flew open with a loud bang. An icy blast of freezing air and snow exploded into the room. The wind had ripped off the door. But no, it wasn't the wind. 3 men stumbled into the schoolhouse. One of them wrestled the door closed again. The men stood there, breathing hard. They were so caked with snow and ice they looked like walking snowmen. Myra went running over. Papa, she said, ignoring the snow that covered him and throwing her arms around him. The other men were Mr. Johnson and Mr. Lowry, who owned stores in town. We got 3 sleds outside, Myra's father said, his voice rising over the wind. Plenty of room for everyone. Blankets too. We're going to get you into town, to the hotel. We can wait out the blizzard there and then get everyone home when the storm is over. Cheers rang out. They were being rescued. Peter held up his broom and hooted. Miss Rule closed her eyes, looked up and whispered something to herself. And then she clapped her hands and called the class to order. Everyone get their coats and wraps and line up. Let's be quick, said Myra's father. Storm's getting worse. The horses are freezing. Miss Rule divided the children into 3 groups. She would ride in the biggest sled in the front with the 6 youngest children. Myra and Annie would take charge of 3 younger girls who go with Mr. Johnson in the second sleigh. John and the guides would be in the third sleigh with Mr. Lowry. John didn't want to be away from Franny, but there was no way he could argue, and he knew Miss Rule would keep her safe. Myra's father flung open the door, and they faced a brutal cold. It was more freezing now than it had been when John was stuck outside. The snow poured down harder. It was like standing under a waterfall made of snow and ice. Within seconds, they were all covered. John held Franny's hand as tight as they pushed through the wind-frozen swirl. There were lanterns on each sleigh. The lanterns cast a ghostly yellow light, just enough to show the outlines of the sleds. Each was a simple wooden wagon mounted on a metal sled rail and hitched to a single horse. John felt so sorry for those horses. Their fur wasn't much protection in cold this harsh. He wondered how long they'd be able to stand it. John lifted Franny into the first wagon and made sure she was wrapped in a blanket. It was useless to try to talk over the screaming, hissing wind. He hugged his sister tight and then hurried back to his sled. He climbed up and settled down next to Rex. Mr. Lowry was already in the driver's seat, holding the reins. John and the guys had one big blanket to share. They put it all over their heads and tried to keep the snow and ice out of their faces, but it was useless. The snow was ground up so fine that it completely filled the air. The glassy ice ranked at his eyeballs like tiny claws. John sat there, miserable and shivering, but he reminded himself that they were close to town. The trip shouldn't take more than 10 minutes. The guys weren't complaining. Were they? John had to be tough. Finally, the first sled started to move, and its yellow glowing lantern light disappeared. The second sled followed. Mr. Lowry was about to snap the reins to get their horse moving, but just then the wind let out a vicious howl. There was a crunch and a hunk of the schoolhouse came flying through the air. It smacked the horse on the back. The horse reared in terror. The sled rocked and almost tipped over. Mr. Lowry tumbled down onto the ground. The horse took up in a panic, dragging the sled and John and the guys along with him, and now they're speeding through the blizzard, out of control. Chapter 17. Rex crawled forward and tried to grab hold of the reins, but it was hopeless. The horse was running so fast the sled was practically off the ground. It rocked back and forth like a tiny boat on a storm-tossed ocean. Every time the sled hit a bump, the wood cracked and groaned. "We have to jump," Rex screamed. He was right. Any moment the sled was going to break apart. They would be trampled under the horse's hooves or crushed by the sled. "Go!" Rex cried. Hearts hammering, John struggled to his feet. He closed his eyes, held his breath, and threw himself off the slide. He landed hard and rolled away as the metal sled rail sliced by him, inches from his head. John lay there, panting. Finally, he sat up. To his relief, Sven was right next to him, and Rex and Peter were behind. They all crawled closely to each other and sat in a huddle. Nobody had gotten hurt from the jump off the sled, but they were all shivering hard. John's hands and feet were completely numb. They couldn't last out here for much longer. Rex was looking all around. "We're near the Ricker farm," he shouted. The Rickers had a real wooden house with 3 rooms. "I'm pretty sure the house is right over there," Rex shouted. "Where?" Sven shouted back. Rex looked around. "Close." John's heart sank. Close. The word meant nothing in a blizzard like this. His schoolhouse had been just a few feet away while John was staggering around the schoolyard. If Miss Rule hadn't come to rescue him, he'd be a frozen corpse by now, buried in the snow. It would be almost impossible to find the Ricker house. It might as well be on the moon. But if they had two choices, get moving or freeze to death right here. So when Rex shouted, "Come on," they all struggled to their feet and followed. They staggered through the wall of slashing snow and ice. The wind's non-stop scream burrowed through John's skull, deep into his brain. It was taunting John, hissing at him while he tried to push his way forward. "You're weak. You can't make it. You're doomed." The wind was right. John didn't belong out here in Dakota. He'd always known it. And now he'd never escape. John walked with his head down, crouched over like an old man, pushing himself through the wall of wind and ice and snow. He could make it only a few steps without falling. One of his friends would grab his arms and yank him back up, and then Rex would fall down, or Peter his friend, and it would be John helping them lift up. On and on they went, battered by the maniac wind, lashed by the ground glass ice, falling down, standing up, falling down, standing up, colder, colder, colder. And then came a savage gust, an ice-packed whirl so furious to knock them all down at once. And this time, not one of them could stand back up, not even Rex. They sat there, sinking deeper into the snow. John felt the last of his body's warmth seeping out of him, like blood leaking from a deep cut. The screaming wind was right. John thought they were doomed. Precious minutes ticked by and none of them moved. It was getting colder. But down here, close to the ground, the wind wasn't quite as strong. The air wasn't as thick and swirling snow. John managed to wipe the frozen snow from his eyes. This is why he saw it, the outline of something very big, just a few yards ahead. "There's the house!" John shouted. They all lunged forward, crawling desperately through the snowdrifts. John's heart pounded with excitement. They'd made it. They'd be safe. The boys pushed themselves along, fighting their way forward. It wasn't until they were just inches away that they saw it wasn't the Ricker house. It was a big haystack. Peter let out a big sob. Rex cursed and looked around. "The house must be this way," he shouted. Rex stepped forward, but John grabbed the back of his jacket and pulled him back. "No!" John shouted. John might not be a real pioneer like Rex. This was only his second Dakota winter, but he knew this for sure. They'd never find the Ricker house, not in time. They had to get out of this wind and snow. They had tried to get warm, inside the haystack. John remembered the fox that had hidden in their haystack overnight. Didn't Rex say that animals were always right? John turned to Rex. "We won't make it," he shouted over the wind. "We have to take cover in here." And now John took the lead. He punched a hole through the thick crust of snow and ice that covered the haystack. He reached through and grabbed fistfuls of the soft hay to make space. Rex and Peter and Sven were helping him. They worked desperately, jabbing their hands in, pulling out hay. They all worked together until they had a little cave, big enough for them to all fit. And then they crawled in, lying flat and squeezed together. It was still freezing cold. John's numb hands and feet were like blocks of wood. He couldn't stop shivering, but finally the cruel wind couldn't reach them. The ice and snow couldn't tear out their faces, and soon the heat from their bodies started to warm up the small space. "Don't sleep," Rex said. John had heard to what happened to people who fell asleep in the freezing cold. They never woke up. That's why freezing to death wasn't the worst way to die, he'd heard, because you fall asleep before your heart stops. And so now they fought hard against the sleep, just like they fought against the wind and the snow. They took turns telling stories. They counted to 1,000 and then did it again backwards. They said prayers. John told them the name of every player on the Chicago White Stockings. The hours passed. The blizzard raged on. They ran out of stories and got tired of counting. And then Peter started muttering in a strange rhyming way. And John realized he was reciting one of the long, boring poems that Miss Rule had made them memorize. They all joined in, and then they recited another and another. They all knew so many. It turned out that none of those poems were so boring. Some of them were about pirates and sailors. One was about the summer, and the words made John feel warmer. There were poems that made no sense, like one about a pig wearing a wig, but it actually made them laugh. Those poems kept them up for hours more, but finally their voices became ragged. Their words faded away. John's mind started to drift. Don't sleep, don't sleep. His eyes fluttered. Don't sleep, don't sleep. John's eyes shut. Don't sleep, don't. John's eyes stayed closed. Everything got quiet, even the sound of the screaming wind. Was it the fiercest stone finally dying, or was John? 2 more chapters. Chapter 19, about 2 weeks later. The newspapers from New York to Seattle printed stories about the deadly blizzard that had struck America's northern prairie. It was one of the most powerful snowstorms ever to hit America, more like a frozen hurricane than a blizzard. Winds had reached 70 miles an hour. Temperatures had dipped down to -40. Cities like St. Paul, Minnesota, and Lincoln and Nebraska were shut down. Towns were buried. Hundreds were dead. It was a blizzard so terrible that soon it had a name, the Children's Blizzard, because at least 100 of the people who died were school children. The newspapers were filled with sad and terrible stories about children who became trapped in the frozen, swirling winds. But there were miracles too, like how one teacher tied her 10 students together with a rope and led them to a farmhouse, a half-mile away from their school. Or the kids who made it through the night in a shelter they built from snow, or the brothers who huddled in a barn with 2 pigs that kept them warm, and about the 4 boys from the tiny town of Prairie Creek, Dakota, who survived the blizzard in a haystack. John didn't read any of those stories, not at first. For the first week after the blizzard, he wasn't sure if he was alive or dead. The storm had ended just a few minutes after he and the guys had fallen asleep. They had been in the haystack almost all night. John was barely breathing when Mr. and Mrs. Ricker carried him and the other boys from the haystack and into the farmhouse. When Ma and Pa got there later that day, he heard them calling his name. He felt their hands on him, but he couldn't open his eyes. He couldn't move or speak. He felt locked away, caught in a frozen nightmare. Most of the time he thought he was still in the haystack or curled in a snowdrift. That hissing blizzard scream still echoed in his ears. It wasn't until a week after the blizzard that John finally opened his eyes. It was in the middle of the night, and it took him a long, panicked moment to understand that he wasn't in a haystack or in a frozen grave. He was in the warm soddy, tucked into his bed. Franny was curled up next to him. Pa was dozing in a chair, pulled close. Ma was sitting on John's bed. "Ma," John said in a crackling voice. The fire in the stove cast a golden glow, and John saw the tears in Ma's eyes as she smiled down at him. And that was the moment when, for John, the terrifying blizzard at last came to an end. 2 more chapters. Chapter 20, about 3 months later, Sunday, April 29th, 1888. Prairie Creek, Dakota Territory, afternoon. The snow had melted, and the prairie was slowly sprouting back to life. Bright green shoots pushed up through the brown grass. Enormous flocks of geese and ducks flapped across the blue sky. The winter was over. The birds were back. John and the guys had returned to school at the end of March, and now, on this bright and warm day in April, here they were at the creek. They'd come for King Rattler. John had paused the rifle this time. Rex clutched his axe, and Sven was ready with his stick. Peter had found a dead rabbit, half eaten by a fox. That was the bait. King Rattler could attack from any direction, Rex reminded him, his voice strong but still raspy from months of coughing. He'd caught a bad case of pneumonia after a blizzard and looked too skinny and frail. They were all still healing. Sven lost 2 2 toes from frostbite and was walking with a cane. Peter had lost a pinky. I never liked that finger anyway, he swore. John's feet was so badly frostbitten that he nearly lost them. His hands, too. His feet had swelled up like balloons. The skin on his hands and feet turned black, like meat left too long on the fire. The pain was so terrible that he couldn't move. For days he was in bed, soaked in sweat and trying not to cry. But Ma kept telling him that the pain was good news. It meant blood was starting to flow again. His hands and feet were coming back to life. She kept dosing John with brown bitters and gently rubbed his skin with some cream that smelled like rotten apples. Slowly, the black skin peeled away. Underneath was brand new skin, soft and pink. Your feet look like piglets, Franny shrieked happily. John stared at his bright pink feet and realized Franny was right. He started to laugh, and Ma and Pa did too. And after that, some of the gloom cleared from the soddy. Helped that people from town kept coming to visit them. They brought food, precious jars of berry jam, and baskets of eggs from their cellars. Myra visited and gave John a scarf she had knitted herself. Mr. Lowry came and told them what happened to him after a horse bolted with the sled. He made it back into the schoolhouse and burned the desks to stay warm through the night. Miss Rule stopped by a few times. Of course, John had to tell her about those long poems she made them memorize, how they kept John and the guys to stay awake in the haystack. Miss Rule flashed a smile, big and bright. By then, John had heard the big news. Miss Rule was getting married, and she would leaving Dakota this summer and moving to Montana. John would miss her. He knew that the guys would too, even Peter. I hear she's invited the whole time to the wedding, Rex said now. It's going to be at the schoolhouse. What should we get her for a present? Sven asked. They were stumped. I know, Rex said, his eyes lighting up. King Rattler's rattle. They all grinned. Rex was a genius. Who wouldn't want a huge snake rattle as a wedding gift? Am I right? They argued about what food would be best for the wedding. Chokeberry pie or molasses cake. They swore they wouldn't wear their itchy church clothes, but they thought they might have to. They hoped Miss Rule's man would wear his cowboy hat. And then there was a rustling sound in the bushes. Shh, Rex said. They all jumped up. John gripped Pa's gun. Rex raised his axe. Sven held up his cane. Peter looked ready to pounce. It was finally time to kill King Rattler. One more. Chapter 21. All the boys all waited. John's heart pounded, and then it appeared from the bushes. An enormous frog. It looked at him with its bulging eyes. Croak. They all cracked up and watched the frog hop away. And now it's getting late and time to head home. We'll be back for you, King Rattler, Peter shouted. They headed back to the pond, shoulders bumping, smiling and joking as they limped along. They said their goodbyes, and John made his way back toward his farm. He breathed in the smell of new grass and fresh dirt. Soon he and Pa would be planting their wheat field. If their crop was a good one, they'd had enough money to start building a real house made of wood with 2 rooms. Practically a castle compared to the soddy. There would be more work than ever as they readied their field. John thought nervously about what the spring and summer could bring. Thunderstorms, hail, prairie fires, funnel clouds, grasshoppers. Dakota was a harsh land, but they were staying there, at least for now. Ma and Pa had talked about leaving in those terrible weeks after the blizzard. John had heard them whispering softly at night, and when they thought he was asleep. The storm had terrified his parents. They had been so desperate to find John and Franny that Pa had gone out into the storm. He realized that his mistake right away. Within 5 steps, Pa was completely lost in the wide swirl. He stumbled blindly, and then he heard a bell clanging over the roaring wind. It was Ma, standing in the doorway, leading him home. Leave or stay, leave or stay. Ma and Pa weren't sure what to do. They poured every cent and their hearts into this farm. And what would they do back in Chicago? Pod left his job. How would they pay for an apartment? How would they buy food? They couldn't plant a wheat field in Chicago. Their neighbors in the city had never visited with pies and eggs and jars of jelly. This would be their one and only chance to own a farm. And so finally, Ma and Pa decided to stay put. And John was glad, because how could he leave the guys? There would be more storms ahead, John knew. But somehow they all made it through the blizzard. Whatever was coming, they would face it. Maybe that's what it meant to be a pioneer. John was about halfway home when something caught his eye, maybe 20 feet to the side. It was a snake, a massive snake. John stopped breathing. Could it be? It was King Rattler. A giant snake was stretched out in the grass. His diamond skin gleamed. His tongue flicked in and out. Moving very slowly, John lifted Pa's rifle. He took aim at the giant snake. Imagine what the guys would say when he brought them the rattle. John put his finger on the trigger. He steadied himself. King Rattler didn't move. And lying there, he actually didn't look that fierce. He looked like a very old snake trying to stoke up some last rays of sun. John wondered, how long had that big snake been on this land? A very long time, longer than any of them. Suddenly it seemed wrong to John that this old snake would be gone. He lowered the gun and walked quickly away. They'd have to think a different present for Misrule. John walked a mile more, his feet aching. Finally, he saw their soddy in the distance. He spotted Ma digging in their garden, getting it ready for spring planting. Franny was dancing around outside. Shadowing Princess grazed on tender green sprouts. Pa was on the roof of the barn, patching up the last of the winter holes. He saw John and waved. The afternoon sun had turned the brown grass bright gold. Whoosh! The warm breeze blew, pushing John along. Whoosh! It seemed to whisper gently into his ear, "You're home." I hope you liked the whole book. I'll read another one another day. Bye. Don't forget to subscribe.